Welcome. This is a tutorial on how to create the worked example 1 in the Getting Started chapter of the documentation. Let's start by creating a new project. First, click on Solution Project, change the project name to something like Worked Example 1, and then change the solution name to, let's go with Workflow 1 to match what is in the chapter. So here you start off in the Project tab with a solution called Workflow 1. Now we're going to assume that you already set up your plugin for the workbench, and we're also going to assume that you set up your path variables to proper match where the NextFlow executable is and where your work directory is, and you set that up here. So now that we have the NextflowWorkbench plugin installed, we're going to right-click on the Workflow 1 solution, go to New, and create a new model. We'll name it Model for simplicity's sake. You also need to import the dev kit for the workbench, and you can do this by typing work, and then going to the blue D, which represents the dev kit, and then pressing OK. And now you see here that it's grayed out as a used language because we haven't used anything from the dev kit yet. But now that we have that set up, we can right-click on the model, go to New, go to the workflow, and then construct a new workflow. So that brings you to the empty workflow node here. Let's give it a name. In order to match the documentation, we will call this Workflow 1. Now, let's try to use an existing process. So we're going to place the cursor over the do empty block, press Control Space to invoke autocompletion, but we'll see that there's no suggestions for it. This indicates that the model does not contain any process nodes from an existing library. That's because we didn't import anything from any other models. The dev kit already comes with samples of processes. In order to use those samples, we need to import the samples into the model. You can do this by bringing Workflow 1 into focus, and then pressing Ctrl M to bring up the Import Model dialog. Now we'll type in processes and press Return. So then it says to import the workflow.samples. After doing that, now we'll go back here, invoke autocompletion again with Control Space, and now we see that we have all these different processes. Let's use the process called Select Sequences by Pattern. That changes the process reference line to this. This already includes the proper number of input channels over here and the proper number of output channels over here that this process is going to use. If you want to learn more about the process, you can navigate to it by clicking on the process reference here, and then by clicking Command B, you can also navigate to it by right-clicking, going to Go To, and then clicking Declaration. Here, you will see that this process expects 2 string inputs, and it expects you to output a string. Below is the script that will be run on the input every time that the process is run. It does not only need to be run on input, however. In this case, we run the input over pattern, which is referenced here. Sequences is also used by the awk command as it receives it as standard input. Now that we're familiar with what the process does, we can use it in the workflow. Now, place the cursor immediately below with input and press return. This brings up an empty input. Basically, what that means is that it has no name and it has no defined type as to what the channel contains. It also does not have anything contained in the channel. Now let's enter a name for the input channel, and we will call it Input Sequences. Now we're going to provide input to put into that channel. We can do this by copy and pasting the string that is located inside of the documentation. So first, if we want to copy and paste that string, we need to turn this empty channel into a string channel by typing a quote, and then that allows you to enter any string that you wish. And now we can paste in the string of sequences that we just copied. Notice though that the input value of the type of the input value is not indicated, but we can calculate it. Click on Input Sequences, right click, and go to Language Debug and click Show Type. This is a list of strings because this represents the channel itself, whereas when we right-clicked on the sequence of strings, it pops up with type string because the channel, it represents a list of values of type string in this case. Now, let's try to connect the input sequences channel to the process. In order to do this, place the cursor over the first input channel and use auto-completion again with Control and space. Here you see that input sequences pops up as a valid input channel. Press return to select that as the input channel. We also need to provide the input channel for the pattern input here. Let's create another input channel. We'll call it search for, and then we should put in the same string as indicated in the documentation. Remember that in order to put in a sequence of strings, first you need to press the quotes, which will then allow you to put in any string in between the quotes. Notice that you can also add additional strings to the channel. They will all be of the same type string in this case. Now let's connect search for to the pattern input. So we'll do the same thing that we did with the sequences input. However, you won't see only search for as an option here because input sequences is already being used by a previous input channel. Now, let's give a name to the output channel over here. Let's name it something simple like out. The workflow now shows no more errors and is ready to be executed. Let's right-click anywhere inside of the Workflow 1 node in the editor here and select Run NextFlow Script. You can see here that the process was successfully submitted and it was able to complete here by seeing that it says Build Successful. We can view the script produced from the workbench by opening the .nf file that is indicated after launching, as you see here. To do this, there's two ways. First is what I consider to be the more easy way, is to right-click on the workflow and click Preview Generated Text. This shows you what is generated by the workflow every time that you try to run it. You can also try navigating to it, since this gives you the whole path. So if we wanted to see that, navigate to it, and here you can see the same exact thing that was presented inside of NPS. You can also look at each step of the workflow. This is located inside of the work directory that was created here in the .command.out file. So let's navigate to that and go to the .command.out file, and here we can see the sequences that were submitted. However, it is often more convenient to print the result as standard output. We can do this in the report section of the workflow. So hover over and report and click, and then press return. Now we'll see this code fragment. So we need to connect the report to the output channel that we wish to report about. We can do this by invoking auto-completion over the no channel and clicking return. The simplest thing to do now is to just print the value to the console. So click on no statement, press return, and type S_out. This is a shortcut for system.out.println. Enter C as a parameter for the function. Now let's execute the workflow again and see what is printed. Now you can see here that this should be the same as what is in your .command.out file that we just looked at. Yep, they look to be exactly the same. Now let's add an extra step to the workflow. This workbench is distributed with a process that can sort input lines by alphanumerical order. The process that does this is called sort and simply uses the Linux sort command. So now we can add a process reference line under do by placing the cursor over the semicolon at the end of the first process line and pressing return. Now that creates a new process for your workflow. Now let's make it use the sort process. Exactly the same way as we chose the select sequences by pattern process by invoking auto-completion again and selecting sort. Now, let's configure it to use the output from the select sequences by pattern process as the sort process's input. Now, let's call the output sorted out to represent that the output from the previous process was sorted. Now, let's also change what is being shown in the report section to be sorted out by clicking on out invoking autocompletion at the start of the word, and selecting sorted out. The modified workflow should now look something like this. Now let's try running it and see what we get. Great, it worked. Note how the output from the process is now sorted alphabetically. This concludes the tutorial for the creation of worked example 1 in the Getting Started chapter of the documentation.